This is Critical Nonsense, our high-low-brow show about science, culture, and tech. And this week we talked to Dr. Charles Chaffin about his new book, Numb, How the Information Age Dulls Our Senses and How We Can Get Them Back. Woo! This is what a Joey sounds like, alone in the void by himself. This week we have a little bit different type of show. Jess is on vacation and we had the opportunity to talk to someone, a publicist reached out to us about talking to Dr. Charles R. Chaffin about his new book. And we thought it was a really interesting opportunity, so we jumped on it. I think his new book, Numb, How the Information Age Dulls Our Senses and How We Can Get Them Back, covers a lot of the topics that we have a tendency to come back to around sort of the intersection of our day-to-day experience and the impact that, social media and other technologies have on, the way those things impact our lives. And so today's episode is a little bit different. We had a discussion with Charles, and we hope you enjoy that. Real quick, I don't think we have a ton of housekeeping. Share the show with a friend or family or enemy. Share it with anyone, really. We're pretty open. The policy regarding sharing it is do it. That's what the policy is. That's how it reads. The corrections department, we have one. I don't think it counts as a correction. Alex is here on the other side of the screen with me. It's a pseudo correction. In our last episode, we spoke a little bit around this photo series in Mongolia. And we were it took me a minute to find it because it was, 10 or 11 years old, and turns out the internet fills up pretty fast. Maybe we should have talked to Charles about that. But I was able to find it, so we're going to throw it in the show notes of this week's episode. It's a pretty incredible photo series. I highly recommend jumping in and taking a look at it. If you've never gone through the show notes before, read any of the articles or things like that we put through, take a look at it. It's pretty incredible, how much a culture can change in a really short amount of time. And so with that, I think let's get into the conversation with Charles. So this is a first for us on Critical Nonsense. Today we have Dr. Charles Chaffin, the author of Numb, How the Information Age Dulls Our Senses and How We Can Get Them Back, as a guest on our show. Can I call you Doc Chuck Chaff? Is that fine?
Well, I'm a guest in your podcast, so you can call me whatever you want.
I won't do that. I won't do that. Is Charles fine?
Charles is just fine.
Yeah, perfect. I'm curious. I'm first of all appreciative that you're on the show. We haven't done something like this before. It's usually just us and our friends talking about a lot of the things that you write about in this book. And so it's really interesting for us to have an expert on.
But are you saying that I'm not a friend? Is that what you're telling the listeners?
We're quickly becoming friends.
Okay, there we go.
The listeners didn't get to hear the witty repartee that was happening as we set up microphones and recording, all about That's mangoes.
True. It was like a beer commercial. It was so festive. Yes.
It was just a couple of guys setting up some microphones. So I'm curious, what made you want to write this book now? I think it feels extremely appropriate, but I'm kind of curious about your sort of individual motivation of now as a time to write this, and what sort of incited you pulling this book together.
Yeah, my research area is attention. So I have a sensitivity to the value of our attention. We live in an attention economy now where we have lots of, which is a big part of the book, we have lots of devices and platforms that are looking to steal and hold our attention. And it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Where Numb really started, though, was actually centered upon the element of compassion. I was really thinking about, with sensationalism, with social media, and every story of human suffering having its own 15 minutes of fame. I began to wonder if regular exposure to those events, regular exposure to graphic images and videos impacted our ability to be compassionate to those closest to us. If I'm watching terrible things on the news and social media all day, and then I have somebody, my neighbor or somebody close to me who has a real problem, am I tapped out when it comes to compassion, right? And so compassion fatigue started that, and then it's evolved into what I think is a pretty much a 360-degree view of life in the information age, everything from social media to dating apps to porn. But it all started with attention and then got into compassion fatigue.
Yeah, I mean, both of these areas are, listeners will know that I talk a lot about having ADHD and have increasingly sort of spoken about it publicly in talks and essays and things like that, because I feel like, it's a time where we can have a more open conversation about these things. But this idea of compassion, I think we're seeing, there's a lot of language swirling around that gets used. I think one of the things in the past year and a half has been there's been more data coming out around this idea of empathy fatigue. And I'm curious if in your writing or in your work and study, if you're making a distinction between empathy and compassion at all, or for the sake of our conversation in your work, are those sort of fundamentally the same thing?
Yeah, they're very, very close to one another. I spent more time with the compassion fatigue research, mainly because it started with folks that work as EMTs that work in the medical profession, that this regular exposure to seeing people at horrible points in their lives, and then looking at the body of research that actually gets into journalism, that journalists who are on the scene for these types of things also experience elements of compassion fatigue. But my understanding is that empathy fatigue is pretty close. They're pretty closely related. I'm sure that there are probably some distinctions that maybe I'm not thinking about, but I think they're relatively close.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some of that that compassion fatigue. I have my brother-in-law is a firefighter, and you see sort of the callous. He's still like a very like kind, compassionate person with his family, but you see in the way that he talks about his work over time that like you have to sort of build up this callous with, or otherwise you're sort of like you're bringing it all home with you every day, and the things that you see in that line of work can be pretty harrowing.
Yeah, and there's elements of that are no different than a callus on your hands that are valuable to somebody who's using their hands. It's a helpful protective measure, right? Where it's a challenge is when we are being exposed to things, given the graphic nature of how they are, and given the nature of how platforms are working to get to the story first and be the most graphic. And there's an element, of course, that's part of this is helplessness, right? So if I'm exposing myself to 3 hours of cable news a day, or I'm, looking at stories online or via social media all the time, and I'm not doing anything about it, right? And I talk in the book about, and I'm not a therapist. I want to be clear about that. I interviewed lots of therapists for the book to talk about, okay, what's the so what of this? And many of them say, pick one thing. Pick one thing out of the barrage of issues that you're seeing, that you're being exposed to, and do something about it. And get off the couch and do something about it, whether it's, volunteering or helping your neighbor, but that element of empowerment is really powerful. And I profile in the book, in the compassion fatigue chapter, a physician who was a resident in the 80s, and he saw what AIDS patients, how they were being treated, how people were terrified of them. It talked about how when they were served lunch, the orderlies would slide their trays under the door with a broomstick and wouldn't even go into them. And he decided, I want to help these people. And he was helpless, right? There was no medication to prolong people's lives like there is now when it comes to HIV and AIDS. And so that element of helplessness with him and with some of the nurses that he worked with, we see that now as a key component to compassion fatigue. So if we can feel empowered, if we can find one thing, then that's gonna help us maybe be a little more open to others.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in your book, you cover such like a wide array of subjects that are all, I mean, certainly are all related to fundamentally like our relationship with technology, the internet, social media, like those, the attention economy, as you're talking about, are sort of like the central conceit, but the way in which it spreads it is, in the sort of roots that have grown out from those ideas in terms of like integrating into our lives is pretty widespread. We're seeing more and more conversations about these things, but I'm curious, like, as you go through this, and whether it's sort of your perspective or a way in which we should be thinking about this, I think a lot of the conversations that you hear about today are sort of framed, I think, physiologically, right? This idea of like, how are we rewiring our brains? What is this doing to our brains? At the same time, and I think this played out in maybe not the totality of what you wrote in the book, but certainly showed up. There's a moral component to this as well. And in giving, folks listening to this or, your own perspective in helping to frame this challenge, like I'm curious how you think about it. Is this sort of like, right now it feels like we're going through both like a moral panic with regards to the internet and social media and the impact that it's having on our lives. And certainly some of the subjects that you cover definitely fit into the moral panic realm, like pornography and whatever. And at the same time, there is also this physiological aspect, which certainly as a doctor of, the things that you studied around cognitive science and the brain, like you have a perspective, like which aspect of this do you think we should be putting at the forefront of beginning to have a broader conversation? Or and maybe neither of those things that I mentioned is sort of like how we should be centering things.
Well, I mean, it's an incredibly complicated topic, and the areas, the kind of the breadth of topics that are part of Numb. The reason why they're there is because they do fall under this this umbrella of life in the information age. However, it's also relatively simple, and what I mean by that is, I think there's a couple of key problems that we have in our relationship with technology and information, and one of them is these tools, whether it's social media, whether it's cable news, whether it's dating apps, or whatever it might be, these tools have evolved to a point through a reward structure of likes and sensationalism and whatnot. They're no longer tools towards authentic experiences. They're no longer tools towards people being more productive. They have become destinations, and destinations where individuals are spending their attention. Our attention is our most valuable thing that we have. It is the gateway to our consciousness and everything that we experience and everything that we could value. And many of us are allocating 2, 3, 4 hours a day of our attention onto these tools at the expense of authenticity, where our relationships suffer because we're spending time through this reward structure and whatnot. And so when you have these tools becoming destinations in and of themselves, our attention, our time even, is a fixed quantity, and something's got to give, and something comes off of our plate. So that's one of the big elements of this book is to try to get individuals to think about their own journey with these platforms and this information. I don't, as you may have seen, I don't tell people what to do here. I don't tell people, well, do a dopamine fast and, take a month off and, go smoke weed in a rainforest or something.
Yeah.
What I tell them, I don't think you should do that anyway. I mean, you might cause a fire, right?
Yeah, an ayahuasca retreat maybe, but
maybe, right?
yeah,
Right. But what I want folks to do is reflect upon their engagement, reflect upon their attention with these platforms, and say, quite simply, to a complicated issue, is this working for me or is it not? Am I more productive now? I think I'm multitasking. I'm not. We don't be able to do that. Am I having more authentic experiences? Am I changing my experiences because I see my life now as a content creator on Instagram and Twitter, and I'm not doing the things that I love anymore. I'm doing the things that I think are going to play well to my audience and get me more likes. Is it worth it? And, some people are going to have an answer to that and say, it is worth it. I like it. And there's no judgment here. But I think there's a lot of people who could even scroll back in their social media feed or reflect upon their time sitting in front of a cable news outlet or the years that they'd be on a dating site and say, you know what, all this that I did, all the selfies that I took, all the altered vacations and what I did to get those likes, it wasn't worth it. And I'm hoping that folks could at least go through that exercise and determine whether it works for them or not.
Yeah, my fear and where I kind of want to push back on that a little bit is that sort of individualistic approach to this feels like it might be too little too late. I think, so much of what you're talking about in terms of the technology is like our relationship with these platforms has been one of sort of blind utility in terms of how they've been designed at best, right? I think you allude to at certain points in the book, some founders who began to apply like behavioral economics practices and things of that nature to begin to make their platforms more compelling, more appealing to sort of have, whether you go as far as to say addictive nature, which I think you probably would based on the parts of your book that I was able to get through before having this conversation. It feels like we've taken sort of a backseat to the technology and applied it as this sort of like morally like agnostic tool that like if you design it is already in sort of like a righteous position. And I think what we're starting to see come out of Congress and things like that is taking the position to start to regulate things. And my fear of having this sort of individual-led approach to things is that it would be too little too late. For myself, I've gone through that practice and, deleted apps from my phone. I haven't used Facebook since 2016. I don't have Instagram on my phone. I've like taken that approach, but it also feels like one of a potentially, an intellectually privileged one, right? Like you and I are more educated. I had studied neuroscience in undergrad. I have a little bit higher grasp on the impact of these things. And I wonder, someone who is, 18 years old and, had an iPhone when they were 10 years old, and this has been sort of an embedded part of their life, whether they have the breadth or perspective to be able to have that kind of reflection because it's just been there. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, yeah, well, hence the reason for writing the book, right? I mean, but I think that, it's no different than the gaming industry. There's no different than the reward structure that you have if you walk into a casino, that you have this operant conditioning, which basically is altering individuals' behaviors to keep them engaged. You walk into a casino, you don't usually find a clock, and it looks like a timeless place. It looks the same at noon as it does at midnight. Mm-hmm. And little rewards, winning a quarter or winning $1 has lots of bells and whistles associated with it to keep you engaged. And when it comes to social media, or even it comes to other media platforms, that's how they're designed. They're designed for addiction, and I think that it is a serious problem. But I think that individuals have the opportunity, whether it's through this book or other mechanisms, to see that these things are not designed with the same goals that they have. And I want to be clear to say that I'm not against capitalism. I'm not even against necessarily these platforms. But what I want to see is that individuals to say, you know what, these things are designed to keep me engaged. I don't need to stay tuned on cable news for that, extra 20 minutes because, yes, they're going to say, is the world going to end? I'll let you know after this commercial for deodorant, right? The world's not going to probably end. You can turn it off. You don't have to, we don't have to have this, our amygdala to be engaged every time there's breaking news and whatnot. So I think that individuals can reflect upon the ROI of these experiences and modify their behavior in some way that's gonna make them work for them and not just be this, again, going back to this idea of just being this destination, and they find that their lives are less and less authentic because of them.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes me think a lot about sort of previous moral panics and whether this is, TV killed the radio and then, people freaking out about cable and so on and so forth, and video games and explicit music and things like that. And this does, to me, if I'm being honest, it feels like a different thing. And also, I often wonder whether my relationship to these platforms or my personal perspective is just one of fear based on sort of the newness of this thing and sort of the progressive change of society over time, or if this is truly sort of a distinct event that has with it, different implications than what some of those other sort of media-related evolutions or revolutions have had as part of them, right? We'll see things happening today where, people will be like, the kids are all right. They're banding together. They're, activistic. They're sort of pushing to make changes. And a lot of those sort of activistic moments are being mediated through these digital platforms. And then at the same time, we'll see other aspects of it, right? Kids are, there's a vanity aspect related to Instagram or narcissism, or, this comparative nature that some of these platforms generate of making you feel like you're constantly being compared to someone else, or, loneliness. And so there are these like two pushing and pulling sides of this conversation that I often find myself being, having this internal dialogue with myself about, like, is this truly a distinct and new phenomenon, or is this just sort of the next evolution of a similar conversation that we've had, in anything like post the second industrial revolution?
Well, you could go back, you could look at, the history of information, and look at, even when the printing press was invented, there were authors of books who were worried that their books were going to get into the hands of people they didn't know, and that people they didn't know would actually read their books. Which, I would love that problem with this book, right? That seems so ridiculous now, yeah. Right?
Reminder, the book is called Numb by Charles Chaffin. You can buy it. I think by the time this podcast comes out, it'll be available.
It'll be available. That's exactly right. So there's always been this, so you can make the comparisons of, individuals feeling outraged about things and whatnot. And we got a problem here. And we got a problem here for a lot of different reasons. You alluded to some of them. We've got issues with FOMO where people are, and even loneliness in a sense where people are we talk about choice architecture a lot, and, where we try to limit choices to make good decisions. We're finding that elements of social media actually has people questioning their past choices, right? They're offering comparisons to curated lives that are on social media or even on dating apps and whatnot. choice overload, where we're just overwhelmed with choices and whatnot, which are obviously things I talk about in the book, and then the polarization of where we are as a society, as we're living in these filter bubbles, and the confirmation bias, and the these platforms profiting off of outrage. And so these things aren't going to go away. You alluded to Section 230, and whether like for example, social media is going to be a publisher or platform, and both sides of the aisle when it comes to that politically here in Washington are don't like Section 230. They don't like it for different reasons, right? There's an element of stifling free speech that the right says, and the left says, well, there's crazy conspiracy theories and false information and that's on there, and the platforms are responsible, right, for that content. It's going to change. We don't know what it's going to look like and whatnot. So what does that mean, being pragmatic? So how could we be pragmatic about that? Well, I think there's nothing wrong with being on Facebook. There's nothing wrong with being on Instagram. For example, on Facebook, there's a number called Dunbar's number, which basically means we can hold, relationships with around 150 people, give or take. So if I have 800 friends on Facebook, the issue is that you have to know people just because you have to know them to be your friends. The issue is that if I have my Uncle John is posting, all his curated life on Facebook, that he's going on these vacations and he's got these great selfies and whatnot. And I look at those and I say, I know John. John's a mess. He's got a curated profile here. I get it. That's not a problem. The problem is with, if I've got 800 friends, the problem is with the other 650 people I don't know. Because I see that and I go, I don't think about it. It's like the worst poker game in the world. I know I'm curating stuff. I know I'm bluffing, but I don't think anybody else is, right?
Right.
And so I start to say, well, look at my life. Look at this guy. Who's this guy's name? Steve. Steve has a great life. Here I am. I'm in line at Starbucks. I'm soaking wet. I don't have any coffee. I got an hour commute to work. His life is way better. We don't know if his life's way better or not, right? So there's elements of saying, okay, how can I manage this? Using this one small example to have, engaging fewer people that I'm trying to strengthen my relationships. So going back to this idea of making it a tool towards authenticity and not a destination. So if I have close family that live 1,000 miles away, Facebook can be really great because I can keep connected with them and talk about my day and whatnot. But it's when we don't manage it and we're really thinking about the reward structure of getting more likes, getting more friends, that leads us down these paths. So that's just one example that I talk about in the book of how these things can be really powerful. They can be powerful to get people to engage on social matters, as you alluded to too. Those things are all good, but we cannot give these platforms just the benefit of the doubt to say, these are just these wonderful people from Northern California that are just skipping through clover, and they want the same things we do. They don't, and that's okay. We just have to find where the Venn diagram crosses and where our goals work with theirs.
Yeah, I think there's, we've spoken recently on the podcast about Cal Newport's book, A World Without Email, and I think it's interesting comparing his book to yours for a very specific reason, right? His book is ultimately related to sort of like the organizational psychology and impact of how one gets work done. And I think, right, when you're talking about work, all of a sudden people are, leaders in companies are thinking about what impact that is going to have on their bottom line. And so action begins to be taken. I think what's interesting about your book, and please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but it is sort of a pushback on the sort of qualia of your individual experience and the idea that it seems that you have a belief that our life, our day-to-day experience could be better if we were sort of taking a different approach to things. And in some ways that seems like a harder conversation to have with culture because change is hard and when it's not being motivated by some monetary loss or some immediate reward, to your point, right? A like, how do you start to get someone to think about the sort of significant impact they could have on their day-to-day life by adjusting their relationship with technology? And oh, by the way, that impact might arise over a period of 6 months or a year as you begin to build new habits. It feels like you're sort of like working against a tougher current because of the nature of the discussion that you want to have with people. Is that fair?
I think it's fair. I mean, yeah, and this isn't easy. I mean, this is a major challenge, but at the same time, so people want to be in control of their time, right? We want to have control of our time. We want to have flexibility. Freedom is just a hallmark of society. We love freedom. We love choice. We also want to have control over our money, right? People don't like to pay taxes. People want to pay less. They want to have control over their pocketbooks. And what we're talking about here is having control over your attention, which is the gateway of all that we experience in our lives. And so when we think about it that way, mentioning like email and, not having Outlook, push notifications, stealing our attention from our focus and whatnot, we can manage that and keep it and keep that attention on the things that we think is important. Lots of people wrote about traction and distraction, right? Is what I'm doing consistent with what my goals are towards authenticity or productivity or deeper relationships or whatever as attraction, or is it distracting from that? And so it's not going to be something that people are going to read this book and suddenly be changed and alter their entire lives in a way to make it work for them immediately. But they can take baby steps. They can alter their environment so that if they are working, talk about productivity, if they are working on a report, they can have 15 minutes where there's no technology around them to focus. And maybe they can get that to 20 minutes or 25 minutes and then go pick up the phone or then go on an app or engage, TV or radio or whatever it might be. But alter the environment to really focus on getting whatever goals they have done, or just not picking up the phone when they're at dinner with their spouse or partner. So I think it's about, we have to manage our attention, and I think there's a lot of people that don't realize that value. And we are an attention economy, which basically means now it's not about taking your wallet, it's not about taking your money. It's about getting your attention first. If you can get someone's attention, their money will follow. And so if we can actively manage that and see it as a prized resource, we're all much better off.
Yeah, I mean, there's a quote in your book. I was looking for the exact quote, but I can't find it. But I think the point you were making was basically, so much of the other technology in our life is not in sort of an adversarial perspective with us, right? Like you were talking about, like your microwave and your refrigerator and your dishwasher are not working with sort of different motivations that might be competing with yours. And in a lot of ways, it feels like, your view on the internet is that maybe we should be viewing the internet as sort of with an antagonistic relationship. I think even that simple mind shift of sort of asking the questions of what something's motivation is, I think it is a helpful step, right? And like if one tool comes out of, one practice comes out of the book, that idea of sort of asking what is some platform's motivation, what is a creator's motivation, whatever it is, begins to sort of shed light on things in a new way. Why does Facebook want me on their platform for so long? Because they can serve me more ads. And why does Instagram want me doing those things? Or how is Amazon set up reducing friction so that, like that idea of taking a little bit more of an adversarial relationship with the internet, not to suggest to stop using those things, but if all of a sudden you look at what would otherwise maybe historically have been viewed as a lifeless object, and understand that because of sort of the complexity of the nature of what we're dealing with in these platforms and the complexity of the algorithms and the way in which we're interacting with them, there is a level of intention that is distinct from historical eras of technology. And so, viewing an app with some level of maybe anthropomorphism, maybe that's too far, but questioning the intention, I think it is an interesting aspect of what you're pushing for in the book.
Yeah, like any good academic, I'll probably be a little pedantic here and say I would, instead of adversarial, I'll say a critical eye. Let's look at this stuff critically. I mean, and again, it's not vilifying anyone or anything. That wasn't the point of this book. People could come up to they could read about, I talk about algorithms and false rewards, and people could come up with their own conclusions. I wasn't interested in this book to preach to people. But what I think is important here is that people say, you know what? After reading this book, say, okay, their objectives are different than mine, different than the microwave. Although I think my microwave's objectives are to burn everything that's in it, but that's a whole separate conversation. But their objectives for this technology are different than my own, right? And that what I have that they're taking is my attention, and that's really damn valuable. That's really, really important, and I'm paying a huge price if I'm on these platforms or on these channels for 2 and 3 hours. And we as a society are too. Confirmation bias and the tribalism that comes from this, and corporations who essentially make money over outrage. So again, it's not about saying capitalism is terrible. It's no different than going into a meeting or a negotiation. Or I went and negotiated a new car for my mother a couple of months ago. The salesperson's interested in making a profit and making a commission. That's okay. Capitalism is okay. But it's good to know that, because when you start that process with that person, it's good to remind yourself, okay, that individual has goals and we have goals, and we're going to try to find where that Venn diagram is. Doesn't make him a bad person at all, but it's important to recognize what the motivations are and say, oh, you know what? The motivations are here just to steal my attention for 3 hours a day. I don't know that that's in my best interest.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious in writing this book, and because obviously you've been, interested in studying these things prior to the creation of this book, how have your behaviors changed, if at all, as an output of writing this book? In talking to all of these therapists, I think you said you spoke to 66 therapists, right? Yeah,
62. Some were therapists. There were obviously some scholars, some researchers, but yeah, there were 62 folks that I interviewed as part of the book.
And have your behaviors changed as a result of going through this process and putting this level of a critical eye on all of these different sort of wings or aspects of the internet and the information age?
I think, yes. My sensitivity when it comes to attention is certainly always been there. I will say, that during the 2020 election, and even elements of the height of the COVID pandemic, there were instances where I did find myself, kind of lured into the debate, especially, Twitter is, my goodness, what just a bloody land that is, right? You could go on there and just be outraged and, say things to people on there that you would never say to them in person, right? But, I think probably given the gravity of what 2020 brought, it creates that, you kind of want that dopamine hit. You kind of want to go on and I'm very purposeful. You probably notice in the book and even in my own podcast, I'm very apolitical. I don't dive into where I stand, but regardless of where you stand, it was a very, very challenging year last year, and there was a lot of unnecessary polarization. But I did find myself on more than one occasion say, you know what, this is not the best use of my time. If there's a feeling that I need to express myself about what I'm consuming as being a hopefully a well-informed voter, a well-informed individual during a very difficult period with the pandemic. There's people in my life that I can talk to about that and not text, but have conversations with and reach out and think about authenticity. So for me, the book, the element of authenticity was probably for me personally the most I won't say profound element, but something that I keep going back to in my own life is what I'm doing digitally. Is that leading to authenticity, or is this just a destination, or I call it a habit of distraction and whatnot? So that's probably authenticity was probably the biggest element.
How are you defining authenticity in this case? Because I think it sounds like it's potentially like a little bit different than maybe where like the colloquial use of the term might be.
The thing about authenticity is for example, authenticity when it comes to an experience. So an authentic vacation to me, as I describe in the book, is going to a place and taking on experiences that I or whoever I'm traveling with want to take on, and not necessarily feeling that urge to be a content creator and pick experiences within that vacation that I think are going to play on social media, right? Or, posting those things and inviting other people into that experience. So I think about authenticity as being consistent with our goals and our needs as individuals. One of the great, I thought one of the great analogies that one of the therapists gave during the interview was to talk about this idea of the need for interpersonal communication, surely heightened in 2020 during the pandemic, but an issue before that. People are lonely right now. There's a huge issue of loneliness right now, and the analogy that the therapist gave was that this, social media in many regards is like salt water. We're coming onto it thirsty because we're lonely, and we're thinking that this is helping us, but it's not. It's making us even more thirsty because we're engaging in a superficial level with, likes and comments, and that comes again, going back to what we talked about earlier. That's expensive. That's expensive in our attention. That's expensive for our time. And if that repeated element, and looking at individuals who are investing an incredible amount of daily time and attention, that's actually going to make them even more lonely because that, again, these things come at an expense. So if you're doing this, you're not doing that. So that's how I kind of see authenticity as being kind of consistent with what our goals and needs are.
Yeah, I like that too, and tying in with some of what we were talking about before around sort of having a more critical eye around sort of the motivations of particular experiences and behaviors, both your own and others. And I think that idea of a vacation is a really sort of nice, clean example where like you're theoretically going on vacation to be relaxed or restored or excited, right? In some fashion, you're looking at it as a break from your day-to-day life in whatever capacity you want that break to serve. And the idea of being motivated in that process by some external event is removing presence, is sort of removing the connection to why you're engaged in any particular behavior when you're being served by motivations from some external environment from the one that you're existing in. I like the way of thinking about authenticity in that way. Well, Charles, thank you for being our inaugural expert guest, I suppose, on, it only took us 130 episodes. So
wow, I'm the first one. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. In another 130 episodes, we'll have you back on. It seems like maybe by that point you'll have written another book that you could talk to us about. We really appreciate it. Why don't you, in your own words, give us, the plug for what you have going on, both the book and the podcast.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Numb, How the Information Age Dulls Our Senses and How We Can Get Them Back, releases on June 16th. And I would say, because my research is on attention, the book originally was going to be around 400 pages. Well, I can't be talking about short attention spans and have 50-page chapters. So the book is designed to be concise and designed to bring stories and add some research and then, as I said, interviewing folks to say, okay, what's the so what of this? What do I do here? So I hope that folks read it, reflect upon their own journeys, and find something in one of these different areas that they think, maybe I need to try this to make my life a little bit better. And then with the Numb podcast, which is available on all the platforms, it's just an in-depth discussion of all these different areas.
Yeah, I will say the part of the book that I've been able to read, the first, third to half of the book, has been exactly that. I think the way that you broke up the chapters into sort of concise subject areas has made it enjoyable and easy to read. And so I would suggest to anyone who's interested in this topic, and if you've been listening to our podcast a lot, you probably at least have some cursory interest in this, go out and get Charles's book. And thanks, Charles, for coming on.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain Labs production. Recorded in my chair this week, since I was the only one on the show from our normal team. Jess, Aaron, we miss you. We love you. I hope, Jess, your vacation was just stupendous, incredible, revelatory. As always, we'd like to thank our sound engineer, maestro, Spanish man about town, Alex Contel, for everything he does and joining me this week. Designer Nora Mestrich for, just like flexing and riding horses and making everything that we do beautiful. We'd like to thank our ops and production team, Sarah Jacobs. I'm doing exactly what we always laugh about. Sarah Gilbert, Les Jacobs, and Tony Vong. And as always, thanks, Ellen. Special thanks. This is a special thanks by myself, which also feels weird, but thanks to everyone who's listening. The fact that some publicist reached out to us and asked if we wanted to talk to someone who was putting out a book was pretty incredible. So, it was an interesting moment for us and for me personally to think that, a publicist would have heard of our show and that, we're not just recording this in a cave. So if you make it to the special thanks every episode and you're hearing this now, thank you for listening. I'm really appreciative, and I hope you have a wonderful summer solstice. I think, the summer solstice will happen after this comes out. So, enjoy all that sunshine. And that's it. That's all I got for you. Thanks. Love you. Bye.